meow, 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 meow.
It doesn't say meow.
Bro.
Who was that? Well,
I
Jeremy's
don't
always
do anything.
You did dual throttle, Jeremy.
Mercy.
Oh my god!
Have you using hot transit?
Using
He's
your
going.
But that doesn't
devices.
mind! Have you seen hot
Have you
transit?
seen Hottie Teen Sylvania?
Oh my god. I don't think he has.
Versus.
Oh no! Literally harmless. Why is the duck so poorly made?
Because I'm drawing on the phone, Hamish.
God.
Bro, it's my favorite catchphrase.
Literally Hamish.
It
Budget says.
Fucking budget says.
looks like a tapeworm going into his
Looks like the skulls you would draw on like your desk in like year 2.
Yeah.
What's funny?
in Paris? Oh no.
Is in Paris?
Hey Slade,
What?
who's in Paris?
I won't cut it.
What is that
Defend the
clown?
lanes.
It's the Joker.
Oh my
His
god!
duck is one so many.
Duck is in.
I don't like this duck anymore. I don't like this duck anymore.
You like the duck? The duck's made its opponent, and it's Pat. It's my drawing of Pat.
It's Patrick.
Duck is gone.
Has he got like a tumor on his shoulder?
It's like an Adam's apple but reversed.
Bad ergonomics.
Knowledge. It's a Homer.
No, it's Homer's grandpa.
Oh my god.
He has knowledge.
Jeremy.
No.
No!
Oh my god, red sauce.
Oh my god.
It's a
I
dementia
like the
hot
hot
dog.
dog. It seems very mysterious.
Oh my.
Red sauce. That's my code.
Versus.
Yeah, there's
Oh.
Batman. Imagine sucking.
Oh god.
I'm going to die.
I'm going to die.
I'm going.
Look at that stubble.
Versus.
He's still alive.
He never died.
He never died. He just wanted to fuck his thing. Look at his eyes. Those are eyes of content.
Who wrote that?
Versus.
I don't know.
Oh, it's fucking throttle. I experience pain every time I see throttle.
What was that?
I mean, what the? That one goes hard.
Oh, a new challenger. Jeremy.
But there is one consequence.
There's one consequence.
We've had some but there
Yeah,
is
that
one
was-
consequence.
I think we have the
You're gonna love
centerpiece for
my
my
hell
full
yeah.
line.
Let's get into it. Let's start things off at
Social media.
social media site. It's too late now.
Oh, Josh, yeah, probably said me actually.
Wow.
Oh my god.
999 reposts.
Yes! That's fucking great!
They're just stacking them up. Yeah.
I'm fascist. Who keeps spelling fascist wrong?
Probably Patrick.
We'll find out at the end.
That's accurate though.
Forgot the S.
Oh no.
Chicken is dry, the sauce tastes like dog.
Oh my god.
Fuck's
sake.
Oh my god.
Origin site.
I want the photos.
The photos and the location one's really good.
We're going to play hard. Oh no. What?
Slenderman is a real
What the fuck? Photo.
Locations.
Give this one your all because points are worth double in this round. Okay, let's see how you've grown as writers.
Badly. Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh god.
Just looking for skill.
It's carry.
Just carry age. Oh. This is a dream.
And you know, that's the dream right there.
Uh-oh.
Oh no.
Oh no.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Squad kill. Squad run. Hi Mark, would you like to view the game gallery and share its friends?
Well,
Here's the draw.
Are you man?
Bondito versus.
Blade, what's your rap?
Slay, what's happened?
Click the pirate. What the fuck?
God.
What the hell?
Dude, Slade's nailing
I
this.
just turn up the suspension. I will fuck your mum using my. I've got a time machine and I'm super striding. Don't know slowness being ungaisu.
My jiggle.
Oh.
Boy say he wanted to get his Jong down juggler snack.
Crying versus Crayola.
Alright. I was racing the tough part of Target. You kinda remind me of the dead wicked bitch Margaret. They call me the elephant. I get all the dick and balls, I'm just that elegant.
Good damn.
Oh, no. Pick up your devices and
Ryan, you got bars.
You like emojis? Well, here's a Brussels sprout.
What?
Fine ass, dude. Let's turn the lights out. You're the fly swatter, I'm the hippo. Come over here, baby. Make those hips flow.
What the hell?
You need to like make a SoundCloud.
Oh my god.
Right, you have to make like a SoundCloud or something.
Ryan, I'll make you a beat. You're just gonna start saying stuff.
Shit, alright. I'm sweet as honey, you're as sour as nuggets.
Oh.
You having a stroke because you're making a ruckus. Whatever until I see you anal. For erectile dysfunction like
Me. Why did I have to go against Ryan last round?
Ryan has too much heat, dude. Ryan has
Yeah,
way
Ryan's
too much
got-
heat.
Ryan gets way too into it.
I'm fucking winded right now.
Patrick, don't lie, you're an avid Twitter user.
I am an avid Twitter user.
I'm tired of endless sex. I present the dick saw.
Oh no.
There's a drawing of the dick saw.
Oh my god.
What?
No dick equals no sex equals no problem.
I respect it.
Jesus.
That's pretty good.
Never mind.
I'm worried. I'm not prepared for my ball-sack extensions.
Yes. Wow.
What are
Your
those?
voice.
Ball-sack extensions, but a new range. Bitch Boy Edition. What? Here's how they go.
No!
That's a sense of so much of this.
I need a place just for my heavy balls.
Is this after you get the extensions?
Let me help you there.
It must be. Oh my god.
$2 extra.
Oh my god.
And always appeal.
He knows what he's doing.
Gentlemen, you know why you're here. I slowly want to get involved in racism. I have found, through like endless studying, I found the perfect solution to being involved in racism.
Uh-oh.
There's no coming
back.
love the.
Constant shadow people in my house are stressing me out. So, this is my solution.
What is that?
Pill.
They're schizomets. Take them. Fucking idiots.
Damn.
It looks like a mighty bean.
I can't draw men.
The forbidden
What
medicine.
are you talking about? My baby will shut the fuck up. Holy shit, it does not stop.
If there's a curb involved,
I've got a solution to this. Stick this in its mouth and get us a job.
Oh no.
What?
What?
Another baby?
Is that a Reddit baby?
It is.
Babies.
Where's the stopper?
Explain!
Where is it?
the stopper's in its mouth.
You're a baby!
Where is it? No.
Baby!
You will never know.
I love having a pool, but I hate children. Oh no.
When you turn British.
Now, you might look at this image and be confused, but actually, this is a pool, and those lines across the pool are laser children detection systems. Child laser detective. Eon. Once the child crosses the laser, they'll be instantly obliterated.
On.
Child laser
Child master detector. You all know why we're here. We're all facing the same problem. I love Singapore, but I hate children.
I hate them.
Hate it,
How annoying.
I have found
fucking hate children.
the ideal solution.
Oh damn it!
Shoot them.
I have the same
Alright, so
one.
yeah, I've got little Billy lined up here. I'm about to demonstrate on him. So you just aim for the forehead and then. Boom, pow, whoa.
Oh, whoa.
We all have the same problem.
Yeah.
I love having a pool, but I hate children. Like, how are we gonna fix this? It's all so weird. It's like only one solution.
Oh.
Oh.
No more children.
Jesus.
I like the idea.
I respect it.